The evening seemed to have been written by someone who wanted everything to be perfect. The restaurant, reserved especially for the engagement dinner, had that soft lighting that made everything more elegant, more intimate, more worthy of a moment that marks a family's life. The yellowish lights hung in small pendants above the tables, reflecting in the crystal glasses and creating small points of sparkle that looked like stars falling on each guest. The ambient sound consisted of low conversations, the clinking of cutlery, and the classic instrumental music that always accompanies such events. Discreet, refined, almost invisible, but always present. The bride's father, seated a few meters from where the young couple gathered, observed everything with a restrained smile. It was a smile of pride, the kind only someone who has seen their child grow up understands. He saw his daughter radiant, smiling, the center of attention, and inwardly he thought of all the phases she had gone through to get there. The falls when she was little, the first days at school, the complicated adolescence, the advice given and often ignored, the long hugs when she needed strength. And now, there she was, about to build a new life alongside someone he believed to be a good man. But that feeling began to slowly dissipate, like something slipping through one's fingers, when the groom, until then always gentle, always polite, leaned discreetly closer to his daughter. The father, coincidentally, was facing them directly, and it was impossible not to notice the movement. It wasn't meant to be anything special, an affectionate gesture, perhaps a silly comment about the evening, but there was something different about that moment. It wasn't affection, it was tension. The groom held his daughter's arm with a subtle but perceptible firmness, and then he whispered something that shouldn't have been heard by anyone. "Don't let him speak. Don't let him speak." The words, spoken, softly but also with a strange weight, pierced the air like a thin blade. Only the father heard them. Only he realized that the phrase was not accidental. It had a destination, a purpose, a target, and that target was him. The instant the phrase echoed in his head, everything in the room seemed to change. The light grew less warm, the music more distant. The laughter of the people took on a tone that no longer seemed so cheerful. It was as if someone had pulled back an invisible curtain, and behind it lay a scene completely different from what he had imagined. His father didn't move, didn't react immediately. He only blinked once, long and slowly, trying to reorganize what he had just heard. Why didn't the groom want him to speak? Why? What could he possibly say that would be so bothersome? The daughter seemed uncomfortable, or perhaps he only noticed it now, after the whisper. Maybe she'd been like that from the beginning, and he, blinded by joy, hadn't realized it. He began to observe everything with a more attentive, sharper gaze, as if searching for hidden clues. Her hand trembled subtly as she raised her glass. Her smile seemed more like a mask than a spontaneous expression. And the groom was controlling everything around him. His gaze was vigilant, calculated, almost as if he wanted to ensure that every second of that night happened exactly as he imagined. The father leaned back slowly in his chair, crossed his arms as if trying to protect himself from something he didn't yet understand, and took a deep breath. He felt that instinct that only a father has, the instinct that awakens when something threatens a child. That whisper wasn't just strange. It was a warning, a silent, veiled, but powerful warning that something was about to happen. Something he didn't yet understand, but which he felt deep in his heart was connected to his daughter. He scanned the room again. He noticed that some of the groom's family members were exchanging quick, almost nervous glances. He noticed that the groom's mother seemed tense, fidgeting with her fingers. He noticed that the groom himself, realizing he was looking, quickly looked away, a small detail but revealing. People who have nothing to hide don't look away. People who are afraid you'll talk, yes, those people look away. The father reached into his jacket pocket, where he had kept his short speech, something simple, honest, full of affection. He had planned to thank everyone, tell them a little about his daughter, and express how happy he was to see her begin a new chapter. But now, after the whisper, That speech seemed to have turned into a ticking time bomb for someone there. Why? What was it about his words that the groom feared so much? What might happen if the father actually spoke? And there was something else, something almost imperceptible, but which made the father's stomach churn. Whispering, the groom looked at his daughter with a cold, almost threatening gaze. That expects obedience. A look a father recognizes instantly, because it's exactly the look he never wanted his daughter to receive from anyone. The father realized that this evening would no longer be just a celebration. The phrase, "Don't let him speak," had transformed the engagement dinner into a game of chess, and each person there was now a piece. The groom seemed determined to control the game. But Dad was ready to find out why. He straightened his posture, fixed his eyes on the couple, and silently made the decision that would completely change the course of that night. He was going to speak, and if anyone was afraid of that, then there was a very serious reason to be afraid. Before any suspicion, before the strange whisper at dinner, even before the existence of that fiancé who now seemed to hide more shadows than light, there was only one story. The story of a father and daughter who learned to walk together, stumble together, and start over together. And it is in this silent past, full of simple and profound gestures, that the audience needs to enter to understand the pain and the protective instinct that the father carries in that decisive moment. His daughter wasn't just his daughter. She was his life partner. From the very first second he held her in his arms, he still remembered vividly, almost like a photograph that never fades, the day she was born. The bright hospital lights, the characteristic smell of cleanliness, the mixture of fear and euphoria that any first-time father experiences. He held that tiny child, her eyes still closed, and felt a silent promise forming within him. The promise to be by her side every step of the way, every fall, every victory. In her early years, she was a child full of energy. She ran around the house like a little hurricane, always with messy hair and a crooked smile that lit up any room. He played with her in the yard, pushing the swing hard enough to make her giggle, but never so hard as to scare her. They had a connection that didn't need words. For her father was a safe haven. For him, she was the reason to keep trying every day. And that bond only grew stronger over the years. There were difficult times, like when the girl's mother left the family. The daughter was young, but not so young that she couldn't see the pain in her father's eyes as he tried to keep everything in order. He made coffee, prepared breakfast, took his daughter to school, worked all day, and still found the energy to help her with her math homework at night. There were days when she would fall asleep on the sofa and he would carry her to her room, even with aching backs, even exhausted. This habit lasted longer than she imagines, and even when she was too old, he continued to do it whenever she slept nearby. When his daughter entered adolescence, a new phase began, perhaps the most difficult of all. She became more withdrawn, more distant, as happens with so many teenagers. But her father didn't give up. He tried to understand. He asked if everything was all right. He left notes on her bedroom door saying, "I'm here if you need me." He patiently waited for her to find her way back to him, and she did. One day, unexpectedly, she knocked on his door and cried, saying she was overwhelmed, insecure, lost. He hugged her for long minutes and said exactly what she needed to hear, that she would never be alone, that he believed in her even when she didn't believe in herself. They created traditions. Together, pizza on Friday nights, long conversations in the car, songs that only the two of them liked, inside jokes that no one else understood. It was the typical father-daughter relationship that grows and matures, but never loses its essence. When she went to college, he cried secretly in the car. And when she got her first job, he applauded her as if she had won an international award. Yes, their daughter grew up. She became independent, confident, intelligent, and he was there for every achievement, every fall, every new beginning. They were a team. He was the silent support she could always count on, and she was the reason he never gave up fighting, not even when things got too difficult. And then, one day, she appeared at home excited, her face lit up with a different kind of smile. "Dad, I met someone," Those words carried emotion, hope, and a kind of joy he recognized from afar, the joy of love. The father listened, smiled, and offered his support. He wanted to meet the young man, and when he did, he saw someone polite, kind, and respectful, the kind of man who seems perfect to be introduced to the family. The groom always shook his hand firmly. He always addressed him respectfully as Sir. He always said he admired his daughter and wanted to build a solid life with her. He seemed like the kind of man any father would approve of, and his father did approve. He had no reason to distrust him until today, because at dinner something changed. The boy who had always been so respectful was suddenly someone completely different. Someone who whispered controlling words, someone who was in a hurry to stop his father from speaking, someone who seemed more concerned with maintaining control than with celebrating love. That whisper, "Don't let him speak." It didn't just mean that the groom didn't want his father to speak at that moment. It meant that the man he knew didn't exist. Or worse, he never existed. And the father, carrying decades of unconditional love for his daughter, felt something within him transform. The protective instinct that had accompanied her throughout her childhood, the instinct that made him stay up all night without sleep, that made him face challenges alone, that made him carry the weight of the world so she wouldn't have to, awakened again, stronger than ever. He looked at her and realized that despite the smile, there was hidden fear. Fear of contradicting her fiancé, fear of something worse. He didn't know yet, but he knew this. This wasn't normal. This wasn't right. This didn't suit the daughter he had raised with so much strength and love. Their story, built over so many years, would not be erased by a whisper, and he was ready, once again, to protect her, no matter what happened. As soon as the whisper, "Don't let him speak," settled in the father's mind like a disturbing echo, he began to pay attention to details that had previously seemed insignificant, but which now transformed into small clues. Scattered throughout the environment, clues that suggested something about that dinner was profoundly out of place. The engagement dinner, which should have been marked by laughter, hugs, and happy expectations, seemed charged with an almost palpable tension, as if the air were dense, heavier, harder to breathe. The father looked around carefully. It was as if, suddenly, his eyes saw everything with an uncomfortable clarity. The first thing he noticed was the groom's family. Before, he had thought they were just shy or too formal. Now he perceived the real unease in their faces, in their gestures, in the small glances exchanged between them. The groom's mother seemed especially uncomfortable. She fidgeted with the napkins incessantly, crumpling and uncrumpling the fabric like someone trying to contain deep nervousness. Her fingers trembled slightly, almost imperceptible to anyone who wasn't paying attention, but absolutely clear to someone who was now analyzing everything. The father also observed that the groom's brother, sitting right next to him, constantly looked at his watch, as if counting down the minutes until the meeting would end. He rarely raised his head to participate in the conversation. He seemed to want to be anywhere else but there. And whenever the groom spoke or made a sudden gesture, the brother had an automatic reaction of stiffness, as if he were used to expecting outbursts, tension, arguments, something the father wouldn't understand at the time, but which would later make perfect sense. The other family members also showed signs of discomfort: short smiles, forced giggles, conversations that were too fast, frequent interruptions. It was as if everyone was playing a role, trying to maintain a facade of normalcy while struggling to hide something that no one wanted to be revealed. But what affected the father most, what truly pierced his chest with a sense of alarm, was the way his own daughter was behaving. He knew her better than anyone in that room, and at that moment, she wasn't the same confident, cheerful, spontaneous, and vibrant young woman he had watched grow up. She seemed cornered, not physically but emotionally. Her smile was too crooked, too tense, as if she were holding back the expression forcefully. Her hands were clasped in her lap, fingers pressing intensely against each other, and most painfully, she barely looked at her father. Every time he tried to make eye contact, she would quickly look away, fidgeting, with her hair, pretending to see something on her plate, adjusting her napkin. This behavior, of someone avoiding eye contact with the very person she trusts most, was a silent warning, a wordless cry for help, a barrier that shouldn't exist between them. Why couldn't she look at her own father? Why now? Why at her engagement dinner, one of the most important moments of her life? These questions hammered in his mind, pushing his anxiety to a dangerous level. The groom, on the other hand, seemed even more controlling than before. He moved his daughter's hand as if guiding her gestures. He touched her shoulder with that dominant firmness that her father had already observed. He smiled at the guests, but his eyes did not smile. Cold, attentive, calculating eyes. Eyes that observed her father's every move, as if they feared what he might do. At one point, when the waiter asked if the father would like to make a toast, the groom reacted too quickly. He interrupted the waiter, laughed loudly, and said they had already arranged another toast for later. The father noticed the speed of the response, the nervousness behind the laughter, the desperate need to prevent him from speaking. Each detail added up to become more unsettling. While all this was happening, small fragments of conversations in the surrounding area also indicated something strange. The father heard the groom's mother murmur to her husband, "I told you this would be a problem. I said that would be a problem." The father stood motionless, as if that sentence had been a punch. He turned his face toward the woman, but she quickly lowered her head and pretended to cut a piece of meat that was already cut. The whole atmosphere seemed out of place for the occasion. An engagement party should be full of spontaneous joy, but nothing there seemed spontaneous. Each guest moved as if walking on broken glass, careful not to trigger something everyone seemed to fear. It was as if the dinner was being built on secrets, heavy secrets, fragile secrets, secrets that, if revealed, would cause the entire structure to collapse. And all of this only increased the father's inner despair. Curiosity was no longer just curiosity. It was an agonizing feeling, almost a physical pain. The feeling that everyone knew something, except him. The feeling that they were hiding something about the fiancé, or worse, they were hiding something about his daughter. The question then transformed into a silent scream. Within him, what exactly was that entire family hiding from him? And why was he the only one who couldn't know? Dinner continued, but the atmosphere grew heavier with each passing minute. The groom's words, "Don't let him speak," they seemed to reverberate off the walls, as if they were not just a whisper, but an order that everyone there in some way was following. The father took a deep breath. He knew that night wouldn't end without the truth coming out. And something inside him, something as instinctive as love, told him that the revelation was closer than he imagined. If there was one moment the father had been waiting for that night, it was the time to give the brief speech he had prepared. It wasn't anything grand or pompous. It was just a simple, sincere speech, born from the heart of a man who had watched his daughter grow, transform, and now make one of the most important decisions of her life. He had thought of some affectionate phrases, fond childhood, memories, words of encouragement for the new couple. He wanted to say that he was proud of his daughter and grateful to see her begin a new chapter. But as the quiet tension grew at dinner, something inside him told him that the speech had become far more important than he had imagined. It was no longer just a show of affection. It was almost a milestone, a barrier that the groom seemed determined to prevent at all costs. The father took a deep breath and, taking advantage of a natural pause in the conversation, placed his hand on the edge of the table to stand up. The gesture was gentle, polite. He rose slowly, moved by that natural instinct to speak, to express himself, to honor his daughter. Some guests noticed the movement and began to adjust their glasses, as if preparing to hear a few words. An atmosphere of expectation formed. But this atmosphere lasted only a few seconds. Before the father could even open his mouth, the groom stepped forward. Too fast. "I need it so badly," too rehearsed. He touched his father's arm with feigned gentleness and said, with an exaggeratedly polite smile, "Oh, sir, not now, please. We have something special planned later," as if it were something affectionate, as if I weren't blocking anything. The phrase was polite, the tone was gentle, but the groom's eyes, his eyes said something else. They said, "Sit down." They said, "Don't speak." They said, "I'm in control." The father understood all of this in an instant. A cold glint crossed the young man's gaze, like a silent warning, almost a threat disguised as courtesy. The father stood still for a few seconds, feeling the groom's hand still on his arm, a firm, controlling hand. It wasn't a gesture of respect. It was a gesture of dominance, a gesture of someone marking their territory. The daughter, seeing the scene, forced a smile, a tense, strange, almost painful smile. That smile didn't fool the father. He knew every feature of that expression. I'd known that smile since she was a child, the one she'd try to hide when she was scared. It was the same smile she wore when she said everything's fine, but was on the verge of tears. It was the artificial smile of someone trying to avoid conflict, or trying to avoid consequences. She looked at her father for just a second, and in that second, there was everything: sadness, apologies, guilt, helplessness, and fear. Real fear, deep fear, fear that her father felt like a punch to the chest. The father sat down again slowly, but not because he had been convinced. He sat down because he needed to understand what was happening. He needed to observe. He needed to decipher the spectacle unfolding before him. As he settled into his chair, he realized that others had also witnessed the scene. The table fell silent for a few seconds. The guests exchanged uncomfortable glances. Some tried to disguise it by adjusting napkins or taking long sips of wine. Others simply looked away, trying to appear oblivious to the tension that had settled in. The groom's mother looked at her son with a somber expression, as if she knew that this interruption would not be well received. The groom's father cleared his throat softly, trying to restore the normalcy of the table. Even the waiter serving water paused for a moment, realizing that something was wrong. It was impossible to deny. Everyone felt the impact of that moment. The energy of the dinner changed completely. That interruption wasn't simple. It wasn't casual. It wasn't delicate. It was a message. The father, meanwhile, felt something he hadn't felt in years, a mixture of anger, worry, and a protective instinct boiling inside him. A primal, profound feeling that only parents who truly love can feel. It was the same instinct he had when his daughter fell off her bicycle for the first time, when she cried desperately because of problems at school, when she entered adolescence and faced internal conflicts. It was the uncontrollable desire to protect her. But now, the danger didn't seem to be emotional pain. The danger seemed to be right there, sitting next to her. The groom, after interrupting his father, raised his glass and made a nonchalant comment to change the subject. "Well, let's enjoy the food, shall we?" But nobody believed that attempt at relaxation. It was too forced, too rushed. It was as if everyone present had realized what the father already knew. That boy was hiding something. Something big, something serious, something that couldn't be, revealed in front of everyone. The tension at the table grew like a thick fog. The daughter kept her hands clasped together, her fingers tightly gripping, breathing rapidly. The father watched everything with an almost painful attention, and it was in that uncomfortable silence that he realized, definitively and unquestionably, something was deeply wrong. Something that was about to get out of control. Something that sooner or later would come to light, and perhaps in an explosive way. The father didn't yet know what it was, but he knew one thing. The interruption of the speech was not just an interruption. It was a warning. It was a desperate attempt to prevent him from saying something that could shatter the perfect facade the groom was trying to maintain. And now, with his gaze fixed on the couple, the father made a silent but firm decision. If the groom didn't want him to speak, so it was because the truth needed to be told. After the speech was interrupted, the father felt as if he were sitting in a chair that was slowly burning. He remained there, seemingly calm, but inside everything was boiling. Anger, distrust, fear, and that protective instinct that grew stronger with each passing second formed a silent storm within him. The dishes began to be served. Glasses were refilled, and little by little the conversations tried to resume an artificial rhythm. But nothing returned to normal, because for him, there was no longer any normality. The phrase, "Don't let him speak," echoed in his mind, mixed with the groom's firm touch on his arm, his daughter's tense smile, and the evident discomfort of the young man's family. He looked at the couple and wondered, "What exactly are you trying to hide from me?" It was amidst this inner turmoil that something different happened. While he was distractedly fiddling with his cutlery, feeling the weight of the night on his shoulders, a light hand touched his shoulder from behind. The touch startled him slightly, not because it was strong, but because he was already on edge. When he turned around, he saw a waitress standing beside him. She had a neutral, professional expression, but with a slight trace of curiosity in her eyes, like someone who had been tasked with doing something she didn't quite understand. She lowered her head slightly, getting close enough to speak only to him without drawing the attention of the other people at the table, and said in a low but clear voice, "I was asked to give you this. They asked me to deliver this to you, sir." In her hand, a blue envelope. It wasn't an ordinary envelope. It wasn't one of those thin white ones used for electricity bills, nor one of those brown ones for old documents. It was a slightly dark, elegant blue, made of thicker, almost luxurious paper. It seemed heavy, too heavy to be empty, heavy as if it carried more than just sheets of paper, as if it carried consequences. The father frowned automatically. His first impulse was to ask, Who asked for that to be delivered?" But before she could open her mouth, the waitress had already finished. "Sorry, sir. They asked me not to say who it was." "I'm sorry, sir. They asked me not to say who it was." She placed the envelope on the table next to his plate, inclined her head slightly in a gesture of respect, and walked away, returning to her routine as if nothing had happened. But a lot had happened. The blue envelope now seemed like the most important thing on that table. He couldn't take his eyes off it. The conversations around him seemed to have faded into the background like distant noise. He felt his heart beat a little faster, not from fear, but from anticipation. This was no coincidence. Not that night. Not at that moment. Who would have sent that? And why now? He examined the envelope more closely. On the front, right in the center, was written his name, by hand. The handwriting was firm, decisive, with adult strokes. But he didn't recognize the handwriting. It wasn't his daughter's. It wasn't someone from his own family. It didn't look like anyone he recognized at first glance. And that detail made everything even more unsettling. If it had been a letter from his daughter, he would have felt something different, perhaps tenderness, nostalgia. But this was something else. The way the name was written had an almost formal tone, as if the writer wanted to be sure there would be no doubt about the recipient. That envelope had a specific target. It was for him, and only for him. He touched the envelope with his fingertips and felt the texture of the paper, thicker, more solid than usual. Discreetly lifting it, he realized that yes, there was something heavy inside. It wasn't just one sheet of paper. It seemed like several, perhaps documents, perhaps photos, perhaps exams. Meanwhile, the groom, seated a few seats ahead, seemed to notice something different happening at the table. He quickly glanced in his father's direction, and in that look, the father noticed something that made him freeze inside. It wasn't curiosity, it was fear. A fleeting, disguised fear, but visible to anyone paying attention. The groom swallowed hard, clutched the napkin in his hands, and for a brief moment lost the perfect smile he had maintained since the beginning of the evening. It was only a second, but it was enough. His father didn't take his eyes off him, and in that silent exchange of glances, one truth became clear. If the envelope hadn't been sent by his family, he, at the very least, suspected what was happening. The father began to feel that the blue envelope wasn't just a message, it was a warning. Perhaps even a veiled cry for help from someone who knew the side of the groom he hadn't yet seen, perhaps someone who had already suffered at his hands. The silence within the father began to transform into a kind of internal buzzing. He knew that by opening that envelope, his life, and his daughter's, could change forever. He was about to. cross an invisible line between ignorance and truth. And once the truth is known, there is no going back. He glanced quickly at his daughter. She seemed even more anxious now. He noticed the envelope on the table, recognized that there was something different there, but didn't ask anything. He preferred to look away, as if afraid of what it represented. This only increased the suspense within him. What did she know? What did everyone there know? Except him? Carefully, he picked up the envelope. With both hands, like someone holding something delicate and dangerous at the same time. He felt the real weight of the paper, but also the symbolic weight of it all. He took a deep breath, trying to prepare himself for what was to come. In his mind, two questions repeated themselves like a mantra. Who sent this? And why now? Exactly at my daughter's engagement dinner. Nothing there was by chance. Nothing that night was a coincidence. And he was about to discover that the blue envelope hadn't reached him to decorate the table. He had arrived to shatter the illusion. The father stared at the blue envelope for a few seconds, as if the paper itself could answer the questions tormenting his mind. The clinking of cutlery, the conversations, the forced laughter, everything seemed distant. That rectangle of paper on the table was now the gravitational center of the entire evening. He ran his finger along the sealed flap, feeling the already dry glue. It was a carefully prepared envelope, not something hastily put together. Someone had planned this moment. Someone had decided that right there, at his daughter's engagement dinner, he should have known something. Not before, not after, now. With a long sigh, like someone preparing to walk through a door without knowing what lies on the other side, he opened the envelope. The sound of the paper tearing seemed too loud, almost disrespectful in the face of the deceptive normalcy of the surroundings. He leaned forward slightly, maintaining a certain discretion, but without completely hiding what he was doing. Inside the envelope, there were two things. First, a letter, neatly folded, written on letterhead. Then, a set of stapled sheets, an official document with seals, stamps, and formal lines. He pulled out the letter first. His heart skipped a beat when he saw the heading at the top. A law firm. Name, address, phone number. Everything is very serious. Nothing in that letter seemed amateurish or emotional. It had the coldness of someone dealing with facts, evidence, and laws. Just below the header, a highlighted line in slightly larger letters, concerning Mr. Groom's name. Subject, regarding Mr. Groom's name. The father felt a shiver run down the back of his neck. The name of his future son-in-law was there, highlighted as the subject of a controversy. Not as a fiancé, not as a man in love, not as a member of the family. He was there as subject of a formal warning. He continued reading. And it was, then, first sentence of the body of the text, everything changed. We are reaching out to you because your daughter is currently engaged to a man who has been previously involved in multiple legal incidents of an abusive and controlling nature. We contacted you because your daughter is currently engaged to a man who has been involved in multiple legal incidents of an abusive and controlling nature. The father felt breathless for a second. His face hardened immediately. His hands, once steady, trembled slightly. He reread the sentence as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. Multiple legal incidents. Abusive and controlling. The words seemed heavier than the envelope itself. They weren't empty accusations. They weren't emotional outbursts. They were cold, technical terms, used by those accustomed to recording horrors in formal language. He swallowed hard. He remembered the whisper, "Don't let him speak." She remembered the groom's firm hand on his daughter's arm. He remembered the hidden fear in her eyes. She remembered the groom's mother, restless, crumpling the napkin between her fingers. Suddenly, everything was starting to make sense. Not a comfortable sense, but a frightening sense. His eyes kept scanning the page, even though his heart screamed for him to stop there. The letter explained that this office represented other people who had previously been involved with the fiancé. It didn't mention names right away, but it referred to victims in the plural. It spoke of registered complaints, requests for protective measures, and out-of-court settlements. At one point, one phrase stood out. While some of these cases did not result in a formal conviction, the pattern of behavior is undeniable. Although some of these cases did not result in a formal conviction, the pattern of behavior is undeniable. Behavior pattern. The father felt that expression like a punch. It wasn't an isolated mistake. It wasn't an isolated slip-up. It was a pattern, something that repeats itself, something that is not an accident, but a characteristic. He squeezed the letter between his fingers, feeling the paper crumple slightly. Without realizing it, his expression hardened a little. His jaw clenched. The muscles in his face tensed. Anyone looking at him at that moment would clearly see that something very serious was going on inside. Some of the guests, those who were closer, noticed. One of them glanced quickly, trying to understand what was in the envelope. Another, further away, only perceived that the atmosphere around the father had changed again, and for the worse. The groom, ever observant, noticed as well. He saw his father reading. He saw his face darken. He saw his posture change. And for a second, the remote control slipped from his hands. His smile cracked. His fingers wrinkled the napkin. His eyes gleamed with irritation and fear. The father, however, did not raise his head. He knew that if he looked directly at the groom, at that moment, he might not be able to contain his anger. So he continued reading, now with a silent determination. The letter went on to explain that this information was being shared with him for a very specific reason. We believe you are in a unique position to protect your daughter before she becomes legally and emotionally trapped in a situation that has harmed others before her. We believe you are in a unique position to protect your daughter before she becomes legally and emotionally trapped in a situation that has already harmed others before her. That sentence tore his heart apart. To protect her daughter. That's exactly what he always did. That was exactly what he felt he needed to do, even before seeing the letter. The attached document, stapled to the top corner, was brutal reinforcement of that letter. He pulled it out carefully, and soon saw dry, frightening titles: Incident Report, Restraining Order, Notary Public Statement. There were dates. There were addresses. There were signatures. There were stamps. The names were partially obscured in some parts, for privacy reasons, but the facts were not. Episodes of extreme jealousy, verbal threats, attempts at isolation, psychological pressure, accounts from former partners describing exactly the type of control he now saw discreetly being repeated with his daughter. The father closed his eyes for a second, trying not to let his emotions overflow in front of everyone. How many times had he thought the groom was just protective? How many times had he thought his serious demeanor was a sign of responsibility, not control? How many times had he ignored small signs because he wanted to believe his daughter had chosen a good man? Now, faced with that letter, his illusion was beginning to crumble, and the audience, following the narrative, needs to feel exactly that. The feeling that something very serious and very dangerous, it is about to be completely exposed. Nothing there is light. Nothing there is normal. Nothing there is an exaggeration. The first sentence of the letter left no doubt. The man who sat next to his daughter, smiling for the photos, raising glasses and pretending to be the ideal groom. He was someone with a past that no one at that table knew about. No one, except the person who wrote the letter. And now, the father. From that moment on, he was no longer just the emotional father at an engagement dinner. He was quietly becoming the guardian of truth. And that truth had a name. The groom's name, written at the top of the document, like the problem that nobody wanted to face, but that on that night, it would be impossible to continue hiding it. As he held that blue envelope and tried to silently absorb the devastating weight of the words written in the letter, a sudden memory flashed through his mind like lightning, a seemingly small detail, almost forgotten, but which now made disturbing sense, like a hidden piece that finally fits into a puzzle he didn't even know he was putting together. A few days before that dinner, his phone had rung in the middle of the afternoon. An unknown number, no caller ID, one of those you look at for a few seconds before deciding whether to answer or not. He was at work at the time, dealing with pending matters, and when his phone vibrated, he thought about answering, but hesitated. I was busy. I was tired. And lately, unknown numbers meant only two things: telemarketing or a scam. He let the phone ring until it went to voicemail. But that wasn't all. The phone rang, twice. Then, one more. 3 connections within a span of less than 10 minutes. Persistence. Urgent. Something he noticed immediately but chose to ignore. He even commented to himself, shrugging, "Who wants to talk to me like that in that manner?" But he didn't answer. On the second ring, he even picked up his cell phone. The finger hovered over the green button for a few moments. Something inside him told him he should answer. But that rational impulse, or perhaps a lazy, tired, distracted one, won. The third call was the longest. It seemed like the person on the other end was desperately waiting for him to accept. He even felt a pang of curiosity, but he let it go. He ignored me again. After that, he received a notification saying there was a voicemail message, but he didn't listen. I was driving, then I was busy, then I was tired. And in the end, the message simply faded into the background, buried among other notifications, that he never got around to opening. Now, sitting at the engagement dinner with that formal letter in his hands, the heavy envelope before him, and the truth pouring over his conscience like ice water, he understood, too late, that those connections were not random. Someone was trying to warn him. Someone knew about the groom. Someone wanted to warn him before his daughter made a mistake that could cost her years of her life, perhaps even more. Regret weighed heavily on my chest. His heart tightened. He felt his breath become shorter. If he had answered, if only I had given it just a few seconds of attention. Perhaps she wouldn't have needed to discover the truth like that in the middle of a crowded dinner with fake smiles and secrets hidden behind perfectly folded napkins. The father clutched the letter between his fingers, as if trying to extract answers from it that weren't written there. The words kept burning in his mind. Legal incidents, victims, pattern of behavior. Now he remembered perfectly the strange feeling he had that afternoon during the phone calls, that unsettling intuition that something wasn't right. But he ignored it. She ignored it because she wanted to believe that her daughter's life was in good hands. He ignored it because nobody wants to see a problem where love is supposedly present. He hated himself a little at that moment. He blamed himself for not listening. Because I didn't answer, for letting the warning die inside a mailbox. But then something inside him changed. Regret became the focus. Indetermination, in an ancient flame, the same one that ignites in the heart of any father when he realizes his daughter is in danger. He leaned back slightly, maintaining a firm posture, and the memory of the insistent calls began to fit perfectly with what was now in his hands. Everything made too much sense. The connection, the anonymous warning, the silent cry for help, the waitress's delivery, the blue envelope, the father now realized that the truth had not come out that night by chance. She had been pushed toward him for days, maybe weeks, perhaps months. That letter only existed because something had happened to other people before his daughter, and someone among those people had been brave enough to try to warn him, even without knowing him. He wondered for a moment who that person might be. An ex-girlfriend? A distant relative? A compassionate lawyer? Someone from the groom's own family, tired of keeping secrets? The biggest question, however, was another. What happened to this person to make them so desperate as to send anonymous warnings and, finally, a mysterious envelope to a stranger? The father felt a chill run down his spine. If anyone had needed to do that, it meant that the danger was real, big, and much deeper than he imagined. The restaurant continued operating, golden lights swaying gently, embellished laughter spreading through the air. But inside, everything was silent now. The memory of those connections echoed like a belated, yet still vivid warning. And the envelope, heavy as an omen, was there to ensure that he wouldn't ignore anything else. He thought of his daughter. He thought about her nervous smile. He thought about how she kept looking away. She thought about the groom's control, his firm touch, the forbidden whisper. And he understood, finally, with absolute clarity, that anonymous call was the first sign. The envelope was the second one, and the third one was about to happen right there, at that table. Now he had no more doubts. The truth was drawing near, sharp and unavoidable, and he would not allow his daughter to pay the price that someone else had probably already paid because of his previous inaction. With the letter still open in his hands, the father felt he needed to go all the way, even if each new word was a blow. He knew that if he stopped there, he would be deceiving himself. And deceiving himself at that time meant something far worse, abandoning his own daughter to a darkness he now knew existed. Next to the letter, still inside the blue envelope, were the other pages, the official document. He pulled them out carefully, trying not to draw too much visual attention, but inside there was no way to hide anything anymore. His heart was pounding, his jaw clenched, his breathing heavier. He had already understood the general message of the letter, but he needed to see the details. He needed to meet the monster sitting next to his daughter, not with horns and claws, but in a suit, a wedding ring on his finger, and a rehearsed smile. On the first page of the document, the cold title, Case Records and Incident Reports Concerning Nome do Noivo. Records of cases and incident reports involving groom's name. Below, a timeline, dates, cities, case numbers, court references. Everything meticulously and ruthlessly organized. It wasn't gossip. It wasn't rumor. It was documented. It was historical. It was official. The father's eyes passed over the first occurrence. A few years ago, an ex-girlfriend. Report of aggressive behavior, breaking things inside the house during an argument, threatening messages sent late into the night. A request for a protective order was made, but due to family pressure, it was not pursued. Further down, another record. This time, it was a woman he had lived with for a while. It described a pattern of psychological manipulation, isolation from friends, financial control, emotional blackmail. Phrases do tipo, if you leave me, I'll destroy your life. If you leave me, I'll end your life. The father felt his stomach churn. Each line seemed to reveal not only the groom's past, but a kind of pattern that was now beginning to repeat itself discreetly with his daughter. The control, the small impositions, the decisions he made for her, the way he always spoke for her in public situations. Everything that had previously seemed like care was now showing itself for what it really was, camouflaged control. He continued. Another case, another ex-partner, serious accusations, constant screams, humiliations, threatening messages, stalking after the breakup. In one section, there was a partial transcript of this woman's testimony. He looks charming to everyone else, kind, attentive, polite, but behind closed doors, he becomes someone else. He makes you feel small, guilty, crazy. He makes you believe that everything is your fault. He seemed kind to everyone, but when the door closed, a different person would appear. The father read that with a lump in his throat. It was as if he were reading a preview of the life his daughter would have if she went through with that engagement, almost like a prediction, not mystical, but logical, based on a history that no one could ignore. In some cases, a note appeared, charges withdrawn, charges dropped. The father noticed an even crueler pattern. Many of the complaints were withdrawn after agreements. In some cases, the woman moved to another city. In others, family members intervened. In others, the case simply disappeared from public records, but internal notes remained. It was as if that man always managed to escape, not because he was innocent, but because the victims were tired, afraid, or emotionally unable to follow through to the end. He wasn't an innocent victim of injustice. He was someone who knew how to move in the shadows, where documents tell half the story and the victim's trauma tells the rest. In one of the appendices, there was a passage that appeared to have been written by someone directly involved in the case. He's not who he says he is. He is not who he says he is. This phrase was highlighted, almost as if someone, while preparing the file, had made a point of leaving it there like a cry frozen on the paper. The father took a deep breath. That phrase resonated within him as the perfect translation of what he was seeing and feeling. The polite, well-mannered, good conversationalist, hard-working, respectful young man was just a mask, a facade built to gain trust, especially from his partner's family. And once that trust was gained, the side invisible to others emerged, but devastating for whoever was trapped by it. He carefully turned the pages. There were screenshots of messages in which the groom used love as a weapon, jealousy as justification, and guilt as a whip. Messages such as, "If you tell your parents, you'll regret it. No one will believe you. You're nothing without me." And little by little, a complete picture was forming in the father's mind. It wasn't an exaggeration. It wasn't a dramatic interpretation. It was a solid, repeated, recorded, and documented pattern. The letter accompanying the document was formal in tone, but ended with something that broke any professional distance. After presenting facts, dates, accounts, and references, the author of the letter set aside legal formality and, almost as a human plea, wrote, "We are not writing this to destroy your daughter's happiness, but to prevent her from becoming the next victim in a story that keeps repeating. He's not who he says he is. Protect your daughter before it's too late. We are not writing this to destroy your daughter's happiness, but to prevent her from becoming the next victim in a story that keeps repeating itself. He is not who he says he is. Protect your daughter before it's too late." Those last words struck the father's heart with unbearable weight. Before it's too late, too late. That expression struck him like a final warning. He thought of his daughter laughing, preparing dinner, excitedly talking about her engagement, showing off her ring, discussing her plans, the invitations, the house they wanted to buy, the future children she imagined. He thought of the entire future she envisioned, unaware that beside her was someone with a history of emotional destruction, abuse, and unhealthy control. A thought flashed forcefully through his mind. If no one had sent me that envelope, she would be next on the list. The restaurant continued its own routine. The waiter served dishes, people toasted. A distant group laughed loudly at some banal joke. But for the father, the world outside had turned black and white. All that mattered now was one thing. The warning had been given. Sure, direct, irrefutable. He felt the weight of responsibility fall on his shoulders like a burden no one else could carry in his place. The letter wasn't addressed to his daughter. It wasn't addressed to the groom's family. It wasn't addressed to a judge, a police officer, or a journalist. It was addressed to him. It was as if those who had already suffered were pleading, from the other side of the story, "Don't let it happen again." He glanced at the groom, still smiling mechanically, trying to dominate the atmosphere. He looked at his daughter, who seemed smaller in that pretty dress, huddled emotionally beside him. And at that moment, the doubt vanished. There was no more maybe. There was no more it might be an exaggeration. There was no more room to pretend that everything was all right. The letter contained a clear plea, almost a final cry from someone who had already gone through what her daughter was at risk of experiencing. Protect your daughter before it's too late. And the father silently answered within himself, "I go," even if it meant skipping dinner, even if it meant breaking off the engagement, even if it meant facing criticism, stares, and judgment, even if it meant becoming the villain in the narrative that some would try to tell. Because for him, there was something greater than the opinion of others, the daughter's safety, her future, her life. And from that moment on, the confrontation was no longer merely silent. It began from the inside, but it would soon explode in front of everyone. The father finished reading the last words of the letter, that final, direct, almost desperate plea, and felt as if something inside him had silently broken. It wasn't a noisy break, not an explosion. It was the opposite, a deep, internal shattering that only he heard. A piece of his heart broke as he imagined his daughter living through all of that, like the women mentioned in the document. He knew that from that moment on, nothing would ever be the same again. But even with his emotions in turmoil, he did something that few could do in a moment like that. He controlled himself. She took a deep breath, a really deep breath, like someone trying to hold the world in their hands. She closed her eyes for a brief second, just one, and when she opened them again, there was something different about them. It was no longer confusion, No longer disbelief. It was focus, determination. A silent, contained fury, but so intense it could set the whole restaurant ablaze if unleashed. He folded the blue envelope slowly with a strange, almost ritualistic care. Good luck with the letter. He lined up the leaves. He put everything back inside the envelope. Then he placed the envelope next to the plate, like someone placing a device that could explode under pressure. His whole body trembled inside, but on the outside, he was calm, unsurprisingly calm. It was the kind of calm that precedes a storm, that calmness that is not peace. It is preparation. The father looked up and searched for his daughter among the guests. She was there, sitting next to the groom, feigning normalcy while smiling weakly at some distant aunt. But her body spoke another language. Her hands were intertwined, her shoulders tense, her posture rigid, her breaths short. And then, for a brief moment, she looked directly at her father. It was a second, a single second, but it was enough. In that look, he saw everything he needed to see. There was no joy. There was no excitement. There was no glow of a bride in love. There was fear, not an exaggerated, theatrical, or blatant fear. It was a hidden fear, the worst kind of fear, a comfortable, accustomed fear. A fear that one learns to camouflage. She immediately looked away, as if afraid of being caught, feeling something forbidden. It was at that moment that the father felt his heart clench in an almost physical way. His instincts confirmed what the document said. The daughter wasn't just nervous about the event. She was scared. She was frightened by the man next to her. I was frightened by his reaction, terrified by the possibility of her father speaking. And that said it all. The father finally understood. The entire puzzle came together before him. O sussurro, don't let him speak. The groom interrupted him when he tried to give his speech. The daughter's forced smile. The groom's family is tense. The blue envelope, the processes, the reports, the standard, the control. Try. That was it. The groom controlled everything, every gesture, every word, every interaction, every glance from the daughter. And that night, there was only one variable that I couldn't control it. The father. That's why the whispering. That's why the interruption. That's why there was silent despair in the groom's eyes when he saw the envelope on the table. The father took another deep breath. He couldn't act on impulse. That would be dangerous. For him, perhaps. For the groom, certainly. But mainly for the daughter. No, he needed to act with precision. Take it easy. With intelligence. Like a man who knows that any wrong move could ruin everything. He recalled the stories in the document. Women who tried to leave and were threatened, persecuted, manipulated. He knew that unexpected outbursts could further fuel the groom's dark side, and he wouldn't give him that power. On the contrary, from that moment on, the tables turned. The game has changed. The groom was no longer in control. It belonged to him, his father, even if the groom hadn't realized it yet. While he tried to regain his composure, his father watched. I was watching everything, how the groom spoke to his daughter. He touched her arm with affection, but it was an affection with sharp edges. His fingers gently squeezed her wrist as he called her love. How the daughter obeyed small nonverbal commands. She would stand up when he stood up, smile when he smiled. She would fall silent when he fell silent. It was terrifying. And now, it's impossible to ignore. The father felt the fury rising, an ancient, pure fury, the fury of a man who had dedicated his life to protecting his daughter, and who now clearly saw the concrete danger before her. But he held on. He bit his own jaw. He drank the glass of water slowly, not because he was thirsty, but to gain a few seconds of composure. He felt the cold weight of the glass in his hand. That small detail, that physical touch, helped him anchor himself there, preventing an immediate explosion. And the audience, who are following this story, feels exactly what he is feeling. The imminence of the explosion. That growing tension, like a wire stretched to its limit, about to snap. The feeling that the air in the restaurant is charged, almost electric. Something is going to happen. That's something, it needs to happen. The father knew that the groom didn't want anything to be said, nothing revealed, nothing exposed. Silence was his weapon. His strategy was control, and any word that went off script could turn into a bomb for him, and he knew it. But now, there was a problem. Huge problem. The father knew the truth. He knew who the groom really was. I knew what he had done. I was aware of the pattern of abuse. I knew about the victims. I knew about the lies. I knew about the danger. And the groom, on that side of the table, began to notice in his father's eyes that something had changed. He still didn't know what was in the envelope, but he knew that his father had read it, and she knew that his gaze was different now. And when a man who has always protected his daughter looks at danger with that kind of calm, it's because the storm has already begun, even in the silence. The father knew that this was no ordinary moment. It wasn't just a party. It wasn't just an elegant dinner with well-dressed people, refined dishes, and soft music in the background. There, that night, something infinitely greater than appearances was at stake. His daughter's life, his daughter's future, his daughter's safety. He looked once more at the blue envelope, now sealed, resting beside the plate like a secret too heavy to remain hidden. He felt his heart pounding, but this time, it wasn't from fear. It was from decision. He took a final sip of water, slowly set down his glass, and without making a fuss, placed his hands on the edge of the table and stood up. He didn't stand up abruptly. He didn't make a noise with his chair. He didn't shout. He was calm, frighteningly calm. The calmness of someone who has already decided what needs to be done, no matter the cost. Some people noticed him standing there and imagined that finally, the cute speech of an emotional father was about to begin. A few glasses were adjusted, a few automatic smiles appeared. But one only had to look at his face for 2 seconds to understand. This was not going to be an ordinary speech. There was a different kind of silence in his eyes, a hard firmness, a glint of pain mixed with courage. He took a deep breath, felt the weight of all the memories with his daughter pounding in his chest, and then spoke in a firm, clear, and unwavering voice. "My daughter deserves the truth. My daughter deserves the truth." Those words cut through the air like a blade. The hall, which had previously been filled with murmurs and timid laughter, seemed to freeze for a moment. The daughter slowly lowered her fork. A shadow of panic crossed her eyes. The groom, upon hearing that phrase, immediately stiffened. His smile vanished. His jaw clenched. He knew that this wasn't an introduction to an emotional speech. This was an announcement, a premonition. Dad picked up the blue envelope with the same calmness with which he had stood up. He raised it slightly so that everyone at the table could see it. "Tonight is about the two of you," he says, looking at his daughter and her fiancé. "About love, commitment, the future. But love and the future cannot survive on lies." Some guests shifted in their seats. Eyes met. The tension grew thicker, heavier, almost palpable. He opened the envelope, took out the letter and the stapled sheets. He was no longer trembling. I no longer hesitated. "Today, shortly before this dinner, they handed me this." He holds up the papers. "It's not gossip. It's not a rumor. It's not an opinion." He opens the formal letter, smooths the paper, and begins to read, his voice still firm. "We are reaching out to you because your daughter is currently engaged to a man who has been previously involved in multiple legal incidents of an abusive and controlling nature." Some sighs could be heard. The groom's mother put her hand to her mouth. The groom's brother lowered his gaze, as if he already knew the truth. The father continues, "Multiple legal incidents of an abusive and controlling nature." He pauses. He lets the words sink into the mind of each person there. The groom then hurries. "This is ridiculous. You don't know what you're talking about." But his voice comes out nervous, broken. It's no longer the smooth, charming tone he always used to. It's the tone of someone under pressure. The father doesn't look at him. Continues. "This document discusses previous cases involving women who filed complaints, requested protection, and were threatened. He turns the page, revealing the header with the groom's name highlighted. "Here's your name," he says, now facing the boy. "In incident reports, in restraining order requests, in complaints of emotional and psychological abuse." The groom raises his hand, almost throwing himself onto the table. "This is a lie!" he shouts louder. "This is a lie! This was made up! They exaggerated! This has been resolved!" But the more he talks, the more unbalanced he becomes. The mask begins to crack. The father, on the other hand, remains standing, firm, almost imperturbable. "A lie?" he replies, his voice deep and controlled. "Then why do we have case numbers? Why do we have dates, signatures, court stamps?" He holds up one of the sheets so that everyone can see the official. Seals, round seals, marked with coats of arms, signatures at the bottom of the pages, cold, legal lines. Because this isn't a social media post. It's not an anonymous message. It's not a screenshot out of context, he says. These are official records. The daughter watches him, her eyes brimming with tears. She doesn't know whether to listen or run away. But for the first time in a long time, she seems to be seeing someone fighting for her clearly, publicly, without fear. The father continues reading selected excerpts. He doesn't need to read everything, just enough to shatter the facade. Reports of aggressive behavior, excessive control, verbal threats, social isolation of the partner, use of emotional blackmail. Every sentence is a blow, not just the groom, but his entire family, which seems to shrink with each new line. The groom's mother tries to stammer something. He was young, things were complicated, but her own voice betrays what she feels: shame. The groom, growing increasingly nervous, slams his hand on the table. "You don't know anything about my life. They lied. They all lied." The father then reads the sentence that seems to have been written for that exact moment. "He's not who he says he is." He makes a point of repeating it, staring intently at his daughter. "He is not who he says he is." The daughter trembles, not because she didn't know. Deep down, somewhere inside her, that phrase had been living there for some time. She just hadn't had the courage to say it out loud. The families are in shock. Some guests look at the groom with disgust, others with disbelief. Some look at the daughter with compassion. The silence that follows the reading is almost deafening. The father takes a deep breath and then reads the last part of the letter. The part that isn't from a lawyer, it isn't from a judge, it isn't bureaucratic. It's the most human part and the most painful. "We are not writing this to destroy your daughter's happiness, but to prevent her from becoming the next victim in a story that keeps repeating. Protect your daughter before it's too late." He lowers the paper slowly, his eyes welling up with tears, but his voice firm. "They're telling me, protect your daughter before it's too late." The groom tries to take the paper from his hands. "That's enough. Give me that. You're not going to stand here defaming me in front of my family." The father takes a step back, keeping the document protected. "To defame is to speak without proof," he says, staring at the young man. "I am reading what your own history has recorded." He points to the stamps, the signatures, the case numbers. "You can shout, 'This is a lie,' as many times as you want," he continues. "But the truth is here. And more importantly than that," he looks at his daughter with tenderness and strength at the same time. "The truth is here, too." He points slightly to her heart. She knows. She feels it. The daughter finally lets a tear escape. The entire room seems to hold its breath. The father finishes by placing the envelope firmly in the center of the table, as if it were a watershed moment. "Today, I will not applaud an engagement that could turn into a death sentence. Today, I choose my daughter. And I choose the truth. The storm has begun. And from that point on, no one in that room could say they didn't know." The silence following the father's revelation was so heavy it seemed to fill every inch of the restaurant. It wasn't just an absence of sound. It was a real presence, a shocking presence. The presence of something that had been hidden for so long and now lay on the table, exposed, raw, impossible to ignore. The daughter was motionless. Her eyes were filled with tears, her mouth slightly open, her hands trembling in her lap. She didn't seem to know whether to breathe or fall apart. The father watched her with a mixture of pain and love. He knew this was the most delicate moment of all, the decisive moment, the moment when his daughter needed to choose between remaining trapped in fear or finally breaking free. And he also knew he couldn't force anything. She needed to find her own voice, her own courage. The groom, on the other hand, was beside himself. He wasn't screaming yet, but he was on the verge of it. His eyes were wide, nervous, calculating everything and desperately trying to regain control of the situation. He reached out to his daughter, touching her arm forcefully, a gesture disguised as affection. "Baby, look at me. They're exaggerating. This is all in the past. It's all old lies. You know I love you." His voice trembled not with emotion but with fear. Fear of the truth, fear of losing control, fear of finally being exposed. The daughter pulled her arm back subtly, almost imperceptibly, but to the father it was like a silent scream. She was breaking the pattern. For the first time in front of everyone, she did not bow at his touch. The groom noticed the rejection and forced a smile, trying to convince the others and himself. "She knows all this is absurd, doesn't she, darling? Come on, say something." She looked at him with teary eyes, and then looked at her father, and it was at that moment that something inside her gave way, or perhaps finally broke free. A heavy tear rolled down silently. She opened her mouth with difficulty, as if trying to speak after years of silence. Her voice trailed off. She swallowed hard. "I really felt scared." The restaurant seemed to hold its breath. The groom immediately shook his head, vehemently denying it. "No, no, no, baby, don't do this. They're manipulating you." But she raised her hand, asking for silence, something she had never done with him in front of anyone. "I was scared," he repeated, now more firmly, even with a trembling voice. "I didn't know how to get out." That was it. The confession that shattered the groom's mask in seconds. The acknowledgement that shattered any attempt on his part to deny or manipulate the facts. "You told me how I should dress, who I could talk to, when I could see my father," she continued, tears streaming down her face. "I thought that was care, but I lost myself. I couldn't breathe around you without being afraid of making a mistake." The groom's mother closed her eyes, embarrassed. The groom's father ran a hand over his face, sighing heavily, like someone who already knew this dark side of his son. Even some of the guests from his side of the family nodded as if, finally, everything made sense. The groom was speechless, completely stunned, mouth open, face red, gaze lost. "You're exaggerating," he tried, desperately. "You know I love you. It's just that sometimes I'm intense, But the daughter shook her head in deep sadness. "No, it's not intensity. It's control. And I can't take it anymore." Those words were like a final sentence. The groom stood up abruptly, violently pushing his chair back. The noise echoed throughout the entire restaurant. "This is a charade, a conspiracy. You want to destroy my life." A security guard from the restaurant, who had already been observing the commotion, discreetly approached. Another waiter, also looking concerned, approached as if awaiting instructions. The father, still standing, took a step forward, placing himself slightly between the groom and his daughter, not aggressively, but protectively, calm, unwavering. "She's telling the truth," the father said, his voice firm, low, but full of power. "And I won't allow you to come near her in this state." The groom took a half step as if to move forward, but the security guard immediately positioned himself beside him. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to calm down or leave. Dice o seguranza." The groom looked around, saw the judgmental, shocked, disappointed stares. He saw that the facade had completely crumbled. Nothing could be hidden anymore. His daughter looked at him with sad eyes, not of guilt, but of liberation. And the father stood there like a wall between his daughter and danger. The groom's relatives began to stand up. His mother looked at the floor, red with shame. His father murmured something like, "Enough, let's go." It was clear that, despite trying to hide it for years, they knew that side of him, and now there was nowhere left to run. The security guard calmly touched the groom's arm lightly, guiding him away from the table. "This dinner is over for you, sir." The groom tried to break free, but he had no strength left, neither physical nor emotional. Defeat was evident in his every gesture. He was escorted out of the restaurant under stern, shocked, and disappointed stares. His family followed him, some downcast, others ashamed, no one daring to insist on staying. When the door closed behind them, something changed in the atmosphere. It wasn't just the end of a mess, it was the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. The daughter, now crying more freely, collapsed into the chair. The father approached slowly, as one approaches an open wound, and extended his hand. She looked at him with teary eyes and found exactly what she was looking for. No judgment, no blame, not anger, but love. He knelt beside her, in front of everyone, disregarding pride, etiquette, and the atmosphere. He simply held her hand and said, "I'm here. You're not alone. You never have been, and you never will be." She cried even more, but this time not out, of fear, relief, of liberation. Around them, some people applauded discreetly. Others wiped away tears. Even strangers felt the weight of the moment, because everyone understood that they were witnessing not only the end of an engagement, but the rebirth of someone who had been trapped in silence. The daughter took a deep breath for the first time that night, and he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: security, because the chain had been broken, because the truth had come to light, because her father chose to fight for her, and because, that night, a woman found her voice again, and a father proved that true love is the kind that weathers any storm. The silence that filled the restaurant after the blue envelope was read seemed alive. It was a dense silence, as if all the walls were absorbing that moment, breathing along with each person there. The guests looked now at the father, now at the daughter, now at the groom, trying to understand exactly what was happening. But, for the father, nothing else needed to be understood. It only needed to be faced. The daughter remained motionless in her chair, like a statue about to crumble. Tears had begun to form even before she realized it. What was happening there was not just a public revelation, it was the end of a cycle. It was the first time someone had given voice to what she had lived in silence. The first time someone had dismantled, in front of witnesses, the perfect mask the fiancé wore. When her father finished speaking, she felt the weight of the entire world fall on her shoulders. Her fiancé, sitting beside her, tried to give her that look he always used to dominate her, the look that said, "Don't open your mouth. Don't contradict me. Don't you dare." She knew that look. It had been with her for months. It was the reason she didn't dare express her own opinion, the reason she distanced herself from her father, the reason she rarely smiled genuinely. The groom then leaned slightly toward her, discreetly squeezing her arm under the table, thinking no one would see. "Baby," he whispered, his voice heavy with threat disguised as affection. "Don't say anything. They're exaggerating." The father saw the movement. The father saw the commotion. The father saw the terror hidden in his daughter's eyes, and something inside him roared, silently, but with a force that would make any man tremble. The daughter took a deep breath and moved her arm away, distancing herself from her fiancé's touch. That simple movement, so small and yet so significant, was something that no one there would ever forget. The groom's eyes widened in disbelief. It was the first time she had done that, the first time she broke the cycle. Tears finally streamed down her face, hot, heavy, liberating. She brought her hands to her face, but then lifted her head. It was as if she were gathering all the courage that had been buried for months by his manipulations. She began, her voice breaking. "I really felt scared." The phrase came out so true, so human, so devastating, that many people in the room swallowed hard. The groom's mother closed her eyes, as if it were a personal blow. The groom's father lowered his head, ashamed. The groom frowned and tried to interrupt. "No, honey, that's crazy. You know that?" "Stop," she said, raising a trembling hand. It was just one word, but it was a word he never imagined hearing from her. "Two." The father felt a shiver run through his entire body. The daughter was fighting. Finally, fighting. She looked at her father, tears welling up in her eyelashes. And those tears told a whole story. Nights of fear, silent humiliations, shame, isolation, and the enormous burden of not knowing how to ask for help. "Dad," she said, her voice breaking. "I didn't know how to get out. I wanted to. I tried. But I was afraid of what he would do." The father felt his chest break, not out of guilt, because he was there now, standing, strong, and present. But it hurts to imagine everything she went through alone. He then approached, ignoring all social protocol. He placed his hand on her shoulder gently, but firmly enough for her to feel it. "You are safe now. You don't need to be afraid anymore," he said. "I'm here, and I won't let anyone hurt you again." She closed her eyes and let out a deep cry, the kind of cry that only comes when someone finally finds a safe place after being lost for a long time. A cry of liberation, of relief. The groom, seeing the remote control slipping through his fingers, stood up abruptly. The chair slammed against the floor, drawing the attention of everyone in the restaurant. "This is a setup! He wants to destroy us! Our marriage! It's all a lie!" he shouted, pointing at his father. The father stood between him and his daughter, naturally, instinctively, like a wall. There was no need to shout. There was no need to threaten. His simple glance was enough for the groom to understand that there was no more room for manipulation there. The restaurant manager, already alarmed, approached with 2 security guards. "Sir, we need you to calm down. Sir, you need to calm down." The groom, now without his mask, turned to his daughter. "You'll regret this. I was everything to you. You—" But before he could finish, the security guard placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "That's enough, sir. Please step outside. That's enough, sir. Please go outside." The groom's family seemed to shrink with embarrassment. His mother murmured, "Let's go. Please. Let's just go." And then, under looks of revulsion, shock, and indignation, the groom was escorted out of the restaurant, still trying to extricate himself, spitting out incoherent phrases and accusations. But it was useless. The control he had over his daughter was broken, and, without that control, he was nothing more than a small man, unmasked, exposed before everyone. When the door finally closed behind him, there was absolute silence. But it was no longer the silence of fear. It was the silence of liberation. The daughter, still trembling, covered her face with her hands. The father approached once more and hugged her gently, as if she were too fragile to be touched roughly. She rested her head on his chest, crying. But it was a different kind of crying now. It was the cry of someone waking up from a nightmare. "You are free," said the father, his voice soft but firm. "And I am here. I will always be." The entire restaurant seemed to breathe along with her. Some guests discreetly wiped away tears. Others shook their heads, admiring the courage. Some even offered low, respectful applause for the act of liberation they had witnessed. The daughter lifted her face and looked at her father with deep gratitude. The chain had been broken. The cycle had ended. Her silence had found a voice. And her father's love, that love that never failed, had been the key to freeing her. The protection there was not an isolated action. It was an entire history, coming together again. It was the invincible love of a father saving his daughter's life. And everyone there felt deeply that they had witnessed not just the fall of an engagement, but it was the rebirth of a woman who learned that night that she would never walk alone again. The restaurant was quieter than ever. The lights continued to shine, the glasses still reflected small golden flecks, the plates remained there, but the atmosphere was different. The air seemed lighter, as if an invisible weight had been lifted from the room, along with the departure of the groom and his family. The daughter was still clinging to her father, catching her breath, breathing like someone who, after a long time submerged, finally returns to the surface. After that initial moment of profound relief, she rose from the embrace, wiped her face with the napkin, and looked around. For the first time in months, she seemed present, not just physically, but emotionally, spiritually. The father sat down beside her, still holding her hand, as if to reassure her. I'm not going to let go. People slowly began to regain their composure, some conversing softly, others simply letting their eyes gleam with the intensity of what they had witnessed. It was clear that no one there would leave that night the same. The father took a deep breath. He looked at his daughter, at the blue envelope on the table, at the people watching him expectantly, and, above all, at himself, at the part of him that had awakened in that instant, the part that remembered why one should never ignore certain signs. He stood up again, not to give a celebratory speech, but to offer something greater, understanding, a lesson, a closure that would honor what had happened there. His tone was calm, but each word carried weight, as if it had been polished by years of experience. I never thought a night like this would end like this, it began. But today I learned, or perhaps I remembered, something we all forget sometimes. Instinct. Instinct never speaks by chance. The people listened in absolute silence. In the last few days, she continued, something inside me told me something was wrong. A missed call, an uneasy feeling, my daughter's gaze, his whisper. He lightly touched the blue envelope. But I ignored many of those signs, because we, as parents, we prefer to believe that our children are okay, that they are safe, that they made good choices, and sometimes that prevents us from seeing reality. The daughter wiped away another tear, silent, but this time it wasn't from fear. It was from recognition, from being seen, from being understood. The father paused. He looked at her with a small, loving smile. Today I understood that sometimes silence protects the wrong people. The phrase became a universal truth. Some guests closed their eyes, others nodded in agreement. His own daughter squeezed his hand, savoring every word. Sometimes silence protects the wrong people, she repeated, this time with more force. When we remain silent, when we pretend not to see, when we let fear decide for us, we give power to what hurts us, and we take power away from those who need help. He took a deep breath, feeling the emotional weight of the moment. Today I realized that the voice is not just a sound. It's a tool, a weapon, a bridge. It can protect, it can warn, it can save. The father looked up and concluded, your voice can save someone you love. Your voice can save someone you love. Reverent silence fell over the place. Some clapped softly, as if understanding that something profound had just been said. Others simply sighed, touched to their very core. The daughter stood up, hugged her father tightly, and for the first time in a long time, something shone in her eyes. Hope. It was as if the emotional foundation she had lost was being rebuilt there, in front of everyone, brick by brick, within that embrace. She smiled, not the forced smile from the beginning of dinner, but a genuine human smile, deeply grateful. Thank you, Dad, she whispered, for not giving up on me. He kissed the top of her head. I would never give up, never. And I wouldn't give up, that's for sure. That night had proven it, not just to her daughter, but to everyone there. Guests began to approach, offering words of support. The restaurant manager brought her water, some acquaintances offered gentle hugs, others simply said, you are strong, you did the right thing, we are with you. Her father allowed her to receive this affection. She needed to feel that the world wasn't a hostile place, contrary to what her fiancé had led her to believe for so long. She needed to know that there was a safety net, support, love, and light. And at that moment, the blue envelope, once a symbol of danger, became a symbol of liberation, concrete proof that the truth, when it arrives, can hurt, but it can also heal. After a while, the father looked around and knew it was time to end the evening. Part of his daughter's life had ended there, but another, a much healthier one, was beginning. She was breathing better. She walked more lightly, and that, for him, was reason enough to transform a ruined dinner into a rebirth. With his arm around her shoulders, he led her toward the exit. At the door, he looked back one last time, not with regret, but with firmness. Whatever the next chapter held, he would be there, ensuring she would never again enter into a relationship where fear had more of a voice than her own. Life began anew there, and they both knew it. If this story moved you, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. This helps bring more profound stories like this one. And tell me in the comments,